History is rarely made by those who play it safe. It is forged by individuals of immense will, flawed character, and an unyielding refusal to surrender. Among the titans of the 20th century, few cast a longer or more dramatic shadow than Sir Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill. He was a soldier, a journalist, an artist, a Nobel Prize-winning author, and a statesman. Yet above all else, he was the voice that rallied a nation when it stood entirely alone against the darkest tyranny the modern world had ever seen. To understand the 20th century, one must understand Churchill, not just as the stoic wartime leader with a cigar and a bowler hat, but as a complex, restless man who spent a lifetime preparing for his date with destiny. The story begins on November 30th, 1874, at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, England. Born into the highest echelons of the British aristocracy, Winston was the son of Lord Randolph Churchill, a brilliant but volatile politician, and Jenny Jerome, an American socialite. Despite his privileged background, Churchill's childhood was largely lonely. He was raised primarily by his beloved nanny, Elizabeth Everest, whom he affectionately called Woomany. His relationship with his parents was distant. Lord Randolph openly doubted his son's intellect, a rejection that sparked a lifelong, desperate desire in Winston to prove his father wrong. School did not come easily to the young Churchill. He struggled with discipline and traditional academics at Harrow, showing little interest in Latin or mathematics. However, his mastery of the English language was already evident. Realizing that a conventional academic career was out of the question, his father directed him toward the military. It took Winston 3 attempts to pass the entrance exam for the Royal Military College at Sandhurst, but once there, he found his footing, graduating near the top of his class in 1894. The late 19th century was the twilight of the British Empire, and Churchill was determined to see action. He saw the military not just as a duty, but as a stage for personal glory and a stepping stone to politics. He managed to get himself deployed to Cuba as a military observer and journalist, where he developed a lifelong love for Havana cigars. Soon after, he served on the northwest frontier of India and took part in the Sudan campaign. In Sudan, Churchill participated in the Battle of Omdurman, riding in one of the last classic cavalry charges in British military history. He wrote vividly about these experiences, earning a reputation as a daring young officer and a highly talented war correspondent. But it was the Anglo-Boer War in South Africa that truly transformed Churchill into a household name. Working as a journalist, his armored train was ambushed by Boer fighters. Displaying immense courage, Churchill helped clear the tracks under heavy fire, but was ultimately captured and taken to a prisoner of war camp in Pretoria. Refusing to remain captive, he staged a daring escape, scaling a wall and traveling hundreds of miles through enemy territory with little food or water. When he finally made it back to British lines, he returned to England as a national hero. This newfound fame propelled him into the arena he had always craved: politics. In 1900, at the age of 25, Churchill was elected to Parliament as a Conservative member for Oldham. However, Churchill's political loyalties were never rigid. Guided by his own convictions rather than party lines, he crossed the floor in 1904 to join the Liberal Party, advocating for free trade and social reform. Alongside David Lloyd George, Churchill became a champion of the working class, helping to introduce early forms of unemployment insurance and labor exchanges, laying the groundwork for the modern British welfare state. By 1911, Churchill's brilliant mind and tireless work ethic earned him the position of First Lord of the Admiralty, placing him in charge of the Royal Navy. Sensing that a massive European conflict was on the horizon, he worked feverishly to modernize the fleet, transitioning ships from coal to oil power and establishing the Royal Naval Air Service. When the First World War broke out in 1914, Britain's Navy was ready. However, the Great War would also bring about the deepest crisis of Churchill's early career. Seeking a way to break the bloody stalemate of the Western Front, Churchill championed the Dardanelles campaign, a plan to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war and open a sea route to Russia. The operation was a catastrophic failure. The Allied landings at Gallipoli resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties. Churchill was blamed entirely for the disaster, stripped of his post at the Admiralty, and disgraced. Deeply depressed, Churchill did not hide away. He resigned from the government, joined the army on the front lines, and commanded an infantry battalion in the trenches of France, facing the daily horrors of artillery and mud. It was during this dark period that he also discovered painting, a hobby that became his lifelong sanctuary against what he called his black dog of depression. Eventually, his political ally, David Lloyd George, brought him back into the cabinet as Minister of Munitions, where he successfully managed the production of war supplies and championed the development of a revolutionary new weapon, the tank. The interwar years were a turbulent roller coaster for Churchill. He shifted back to the Conservative Party and served as Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1920s, a tenure marked by his controversial decision to return Britain to the gold standard, which led to economic deflation and a general strike. When the government changed in 1929, Churchill found himself out of office. Thus began the period known as his wilderness years. Throughout the 1930s, Churchill was politically isolated. He watched from the sidelines as Adolf Hitler rose to power in Germany, while the British government, led by Neville Chamberlain, pursued a policy of appeasement, hoping to avoid another catastrophic war by giving in to Hitler's territorial demands. Churchill spoke out with prophetic urgency. In speech after speech in Parliament and articles in newspapers, he warned that Nazi Germany was rearming at an unprecedented rate. He called appeasement an unmitigated disaster and warned that war was inevitable. For his efforts, he was dismissed as a warmonger and an eccentric dinosaur whose time had passed. But history proved Churchill right. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland and the Second World War began. The British public and politicians realized they had ignored the one man who had seen the danger clearly. Churchill was immediately recalled to his old post as First Lord of the Admiralty. The fleet received a simple, iconic radio message: Winston is back. The early months of the war went disastrously for the Allies. In May 1940, the German blitzkrieg swept through France and the Low Countries, shattering Allied defenses. The British government faced a profound crisis of leadership. Neville Chamberlain resigned, and on May 10, 1940, Winston Churchill walked into Buckingham Palace to kiss the hands of King George VI and accept the position of Prime Minister. He was 65 years old. The situation Churchill inherited was catastrophic. France was collapsing, and the British Expeditionary Force was trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, facing annihilation. Many within the British cabinet, including Foreign Secretary Lord Halifax, believed that the war was lost and argued that Britain should negotiate a peace treaty with Hitler through Italy. It was Churchill's finest, most critical hour. He fiercely rejected any thought of surrender, arguing that terms dictated by Germany would turn Britain into a slave state. Through sheer force of personality and unmatched eloquence, he united his cabinet and the nation behind the resolve to fight on. Churchill understood that in a total war, words could be as powerful as weapons. He used his radio broadcast to mobilize the psychological resilience of the British people. During the miraculous evacuation of over 300,000 soldiers from Dunkirk, Churchill delivered one of the most famous speeches in human history, declaring, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." Following the fall of France, Britain stood alone against a Nazi-dominated Europe. Hitler launched the Luftwaffe to crush the Royal Air Force in preparation for an invasion, beginning the Battle of Britain. Night after night, British cities were subjected to horrific bombings known as the Blitz. Churchill refused to hide in deep bunkers. He walked the devastated streets of London, smoking his cigar, flashing the V for Victory sign, and weeping openly with citizens who had lost everything. His presence injected defiance into the veins of the population. When the Royal Air Force successfully repelled the German air assault, Churchill immortalized the young pilots with the words, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Churchill knew that Britain could not defeat Germany entirely on its own. He spent months cultivating a close relationship with American President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, securing vital supplies through the Lend-Lease program long before the United States entered the war. When Hitler made the fatal mistake of invading the Soviet Union in June 1941, and the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December of that year, Churchill knew that victory was ultimately assured. The Grand Alliance of Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union was formed. Throughout the rest of the war, Churchill traveled tirelessly across the globe, attending high-stakes conferences in Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam to coordinate strategy with Roosevelt and Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin. He was a difficult ally, prone to micromanagement and strategic eccentricities, but his dedication to total victory never wavered. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day was declared. Churchill addressed a massive roaring crowd in London, telling them, "This is your victory." The crowd shouted back, "No, it is yours." Yet, the gratitude of politics is notoriously short-lived. Just weeks after Germany's surrender, Britain held its first general election in a decade. The British people, exhausted by years of war and looking toward a future of social reform and rebuilding, voted Churchill's Conservative Party out of office in a landslide victory for the Labour Party. It was a stunning blow to Churchill, who suddenly found himself a private citizen once again. True to his nature, Churchill did not retire. In 1946, during a visit to the United States, he delivered a speech in Fulton, Missouri that defined the next era of global politics. He warned that an iron curtain had descended across the continent of Europe, marking the beginning of the Cold War against Soviet expansionism. He devoted much of his time to writing his massive, 6-volume history of the Second World War, a masterpiece that, along with his lifetime of brilliant oratory, earned him the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1953. In 1951, at the age of 76, Churchill achieved one final political comeback, becoming Prime Minister for a second time. His second term focused on managing the decline of the British Empire and attempting to ease Cold War tensions, though failing health ultimately forced him to resign in 1955. Winston Churchill spent his final years quietly, painting at his beloved country home, Chartwell, and enjoying the company of his devoted wife, Clementine, who had been his rock for over 50 years. On January 24, 1965, at the age of 90, the great man passed away, 90 years to the day after the death of his father. Britain honored him with a grand state funeral, an honor rarely granted to anyone outside the royal family. Millions of people lined the streets of London in absolute silence. As the boat carrying his coffin passed down the River Thames, the dock cranes, in a spontaneous gesture of profound respect, lowered their jibs like bowed heads. Winston Churchill was a man of immense contradictions. He made strategic errors, held imperialist views that were outdated even in his own time, and possessed an ego as vast as the empire he served. But when Western civilization faced an existential abyss, his stubbornness, his courage, and his absolute refusal to compromise with evil became the shield that saved the free world. He proved that one voice, filled with conviction, can change the course of human history.